with us a paper entitled Violence and Love, Assessing the Impact of Orthodox Teaching on the LGBTQ plus community and the Opening Way for Pastoral Care. Now, Nik is a British Serb musician, vlogger, and human rights activist working in the UK and Eastern Europe with a BA in theology from King's College London. His work focuses on the interaction between the LGBTQ plus community and Orthodox Christian theology and identity.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to speak to you all here today. Before I start, I just wanted to say that when I was at secondary school, I learned about a guy called Richard Swinburne, and I remember reading his arguments and finding them really fascinating and incredible. And then, as you've heard, I went to King's College London, so you know I'm an Oxford reject. And when I had my interview at Oriel College, I was amazed to find that is where Richard Swinburne teaches. And I thought, wow, it's so amazing to be here at this place where this person is. And to now be talking to you, Mr. Swinburne, is an honor for me, actually, in a way. I find the idea of this panel very exciting. The subject matter that has brought us all here to Oxford has many very vital theoretical facets. But what we're discussing right now is practical applications. From the myriad approaches we've seen over the past few days, it's clear that our tradition is a bountiful feast. But how do we share it with those who are hungry for salvation? How do we share it for those who need our help? That is what pastoral care means to me. How best to offer pastoral care to the LGBTQ plus community has been a recurring theme. And in our opening session, someone described our current response as a wall of silence. With all due respect, I found this comment very troubling because it showed me how far removed our conversations here at this great university are from those being had in the rest of the Orthodox world. I spent the last few years of my life traveling to Orthodox countries working with LGBTQ plus individuals. And I can tell you that the response of the Church has been clear, and it has been one of violence. Over the past 30 years, most notably in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the Orthodox Church has taken an impenetrable reactionary stance against the push for equal human rights. And this has frequently manifested in violence. And where there is violence, there cannot be pastoral care. Today I want to look at the sorts of violence that are justified in Orthodoxy, the way it impacts on people's lives, and finally offer some of my own suggestions for how to open the way for pastoral care. I will focus primarily on the churches of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, and those inclined towards same-sex love and relationships, as this has been the primary focus of my work. Firstly, I want to start by looking at two different categories. So firstly, physical violence. Generally, when we speak of the theology of physical violence, we do so in relation to war and conflict. But it is also very much a social issue, something that is found as much in the streets and in people's homes as much as it is found in battle. We regard the use of physical violence as a misstep in one's path towards God. To quote Philip Lemasters, "To kill a human being is to do the work of death, to involve oneself in a paradigmatic act of spiritual brokenness and estrangement from God and neighbour." End quote. The early church was marked by practices of peace, and it wasn't until the rule of Constantine that real Christian violence was possible. In this Constantinian shift, the faith of the persecuted gained the power to persecute, and for some it proved a temptation all too hard to resist. Though non-violence has remained deeply ingrained in our theology, one might look to the writings of St. Basil the Great, for example, the seeds were sown for something quite destructive. I would argue that in the past few decades we have seen a dynamic change not entirely unlike the one seen in the 4th century. For much of the 20th century, large swathes of the Orthodox Church existed under the persecution of communism. Now we are blessed with freedom, and our faith has bloomed and found new strength. Yet this shift from powerless to powerful has seen elements of history repeat itself. In an attempt to assert identity and power under Constantine, Christians persecuted individuals perceived to undermine the hegemony of the Church and the empire, pagans and heretics, for example. Today, it's seen that Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe feel similarly about the LGBT community, who are called the new pagans and heretics, and portrayed as undermining the newly formed communist nations, post-communist nation states, families, and the Church. As such, Orthodox Christians in these countries have created a hostile world to suppress, drive out, or in extreme cases even exterminate people inclined to relationships with people of the same gender. A cursory glance of the ILGA rainbow map of Europe, a map that scores European countries on their LGBTQ+ human rights records, shows the seriousness of the situation. Countries where Orthodox Christianity is the predominant religion, on average, have the lowest scores. For the LGBTQ+ individuals in these nations, the threat of violence is a fact of life. The Eastern Orthodox country with the lowest score is Russia, which has established itself as a leader in the war against people who seek same-sex love and relationships. 4 weeks ago, on July 21st, Yelena Grigorieva, a 41-year-old human rights activist from St. Petersburg, was stabbed repeatedly in her face and the back of her head. She was listed on a Russian site called Pila, which translates to Saw. The site encourages individuals to murder LGBTQ+ activists in ways seen in the Saw horror movie franchise. Photos of other victims of this online murder game were posted on the site, but not all of their identities have been confirmed. This is, of course, not the only example of groups that hunt LGBTQ+ individuals in Russia. The most famous of which is Occupy Paedophilia. Members of this group employ the use of dating websites to win the trust of people looking for relationships and lure individuals on dates and then beat them, sometimes urinate on them, which they call a cure, and humiliate them on camera. A frequent feature of their videos is to take the victim's phone and call family members to out them in the hope that they will be rejected from their families' jobs and wider communities. Russia has also its famous anti-propaganda law, which treats all members of the LGBTQ+ community as potential paedophiles and makes it illegal to talk to anyone under the age of 18 positively about the LGBTQ+ community. Surveys of public opinion in Russia reveal the depth to which Russians accept violence towards the LGBTQ+ community, with statistics such as those published by the Levada Center in 2015 that show 1 in 5 Russians believe that homosexuals should be liquidated. The Russian Church has done nothing to challenge this violence, which is, I hope you will agree, both unchristian and horrifying. Rather, they form a significant part of the anti-LGBT lobby which has led to this situation, and to this day seek to further diminish the rights of LGBT people in their country. Kirill himself has stoked this hysteria by stating that the advancements of LGBT rights in other countries are a sign of the apocalypse. But these problems are, of course, only limited to Russia. This year's the first Pride that took place this year in Georgia was called off after far-right Orthodox Christian activists attacked the offices of organisers and threatened to decapitate them. An anti-Pride march was organised by the Patriarchate and also supported by Levan Lavajde, who called for street gangs to violently disrupt the march. In Macedonia, on the 4th of July of this year, an LGBT activist was dragged from his car and beaten as people told him they were going to rape him. In Moldova this year in June, a straight human rights lawyer who works for the LGBT organisation GenderDoc was the victim of an arson attack on her car. Last year in Greece, a gay man was lynched and killed in the streets of Athens. In my own personal work in Serbia over the past few years, I've met individuals and activists who've had their homes ransacked or firebombed, who've been beaten in the street in broad daylight, women who've been victims of corrective rape, that's the idea that if a woman is forced to have heterosexual sex, it will convert her, and a whole list of other assaults. Physical violence against the LGBTQ+ community in the Orthodox world is pandemic. This makes it possible for LGBTQ+ individuals to seek pastoral care in the church. Even those of the most devout faith fear the church, fear going to services, fear talking to the clergy and monastics, and even fear talking to other members of the congregation. There cannot be pastoral care in this environment. There are those who may try and counter and say that the Orthodox Church does not expressly encourage its members to murder or perpetrate acts of physical violence and so bears no responsibility. But to my mind, that is a mealy-mouthed excuse. Anti-Pride marches, as seen in Georgia, this year, Moldova, Serbia and other countries, see clergy and monastics standing side by side with neo-Nazis and far-right thugs. When the living icons of Christ stand shoulder to shoulder and even offer blessings to those with the intent of causing physical pain or taking the lives of LGBT individuals, the Church does not need to say it expressly calls for violence. They have shown what side they're on. Additionally, as mentioned, churches make up a major part of political lobbies against the progression of human rights for queer and trans individuals. Without sufficient legislature, there is no framework where the perpetrators of violence can be brought to justice. Even if we maintain that we see the use of physical violence as sinful, these sorts of actions from the Church lead many believers to the conclusion that attacks on individual members of the LGBTQ+ community are justifiable within the Orthodox faith. Psychological violence. It should come as no surprise that the level of physical violence leads to psychological trauma. Straight after this panel, there are people looking at therapeutic approaches, so I will leave the discussion of statistics, studies, and research to their more capable hands. But this is something that I have extensive personal experience with. I grew up in a proudly Orthodox family. My grandparents' generation were those forced into exile by Tito for being too close to the old order. And from an early age, it was impressed on me how precious and beautiful our tradition is, and how vital it was to keep it alive no matter where we were made to go. I grew up loving our church, and I cannot imagine my life outside of it. So age 11, when I first came to the realization that there was something different about me, I looked to my faith for guidance. It just so happened that was the year of the first Belgrade Pride. In my home on my computer, I watched clergy and monastics running through the streets side by side with football hooligans and far-right thugs attacking men and women, shouting "Smrt pederima," which means death to faggots. I learned from them that I was perverted, evil, unnatural, and certainly neither Serbian or Orthodox. I wanted desperately to change, but learned quickly that I couldn't. I came to the conclusion that salvation was impossible for me no matter what I did. I hated myself for it, and it led myself to thoughts of suicide and self-harm by the age of 13. It was only 2 years ago that I could bring myself to tell a priest that I'm gay, so you can imagine how bizarre this whole situation is for me right now. I've given my example because it shows that the violence that happens in traditional Orthodox countries can bleed out into the diaspora. Children of otherwise tolerant families or individuals who have the most compassionate and caring priests can still find themselves traumatized by the dissonance this causes in their identity and leads to serious harm. I've lost friends to this psychological violence, and what makes it so terrifying and insidious is that we will never know the body count of those who might have been saved if they were shown the love and compassion the church should have given them. Two factors to my mind in particular exacerbate the situation. The treatment of homosexuality as a sin, that is, condemning not the act but the person for feeling attraction. It leads people to believe that they are irredeemably evil and unable to find salvation. I think this is something that broadly at this conference actually we've made a differentiation between, and I'm very grateful for that. But it's not necessarily seen in the wider Orthodox world. Secondly, the idea that we can change people's sexuality. Again, this is something I'm sure the therapeutic panel will discuss, so I shall leave it to them to talk about the harm of psychological conversion therapies. In my own work, I've come into contact and tried to raise awareness of more spiritual conversion therapies, particularly exorcisms aimed at changing people's individual orientation. And they've been finding a newfound popularity, particularly in northeastern Europe. I made a short documentary on my YouTube channel where I went to the Saharna monastery in northern Moldova and had a ceremony performed on me to show what can be expected at such a service. During my exorcism, which has not yet worked, I was jabbed repeatedly with the Holy Lance for the pleasure of paying onlookers. It may interest you to know that there were different levels of exorcisms available at different prices. I found it to be one of the most terrifying experiences of my life so far, and I can only imagine the harm it would have done to someone in a more vulnerable state than myself. It is also by far not the worst method of exorcism I have come into contact with. For some Orthodox LGBTQ+ individuals, this is the pastoral care offered by the Church, and its effects can be as dangerous to life as physical violence. So to conclude, where there is violence, there cannot be pastoral care. And I do believe there are things we can do to stem the tide of violence and make a more compassionate church. Number one, acknowledge that violence has been our response. There has not been a wall of silence. Perhaps it's true that there has not been a concerted effort until recent years to formulate an official Orthodox position to this situation, but we must accept that a great deal has already been said, and its effects have led to huge amounts of pain and extreme cases mortality. For this, we all have responsibility. Secondly, we should condemn violence. We must condemn the use of violence against LGBTQ+ community. Even if we choose to maintain same-sex sex as sinful, violence is not a reasonable response to dealing with sin. I do not think it is enough, however, to be passively nonviolent. In the face of all I said, I hope you can agree that perhaps the time has come for us to be active in our pursuit of peace. It's probably time the Church thinks more carefully about which individuals, political parties and movements we find ourselves in bed with. Thirdly, and most importantly, and this is the point I hope you can all take home with you, we need to tell people that there is a debate. As a teenager, I had the privilege of access to libraries and the internet and a moderate amount of intelligence. So I began reading about the question of sexuality in the church, and I realized that this debate is not closed. There are sides to this debate. It is complex, and there is room for love, and there will always be room for everyone in the church. What has been said at this conference would be, to many people's ears, revolutionary. Please let the people know that this discussion is being had, because it will change people's lives. Especially coming from such wise and respected people as we have in this room, I implore you to be brave. To finish, I want to offer a quote by the former Patriarch Pavle of the Serbian Orthodox Church. No sin committed by one person justifies a sin committed by another. We will all face the last judgment together, where each of us must answer for his sins. No one can justify his sins by saying else is guilty of a crime. The way of non-violence and cooperation is the only way blessed by God. Thank you.